My name is Rob Wainwright. I'm the Executive Director of Europol, the European Law Enforcement Agency. One of the things we do is run the European Cybercrime Centre, around 200 high-profile investigations a year, bringing together police forces, but increasingly industry as well. So this is a session about geopolitical cyberspace, and I'd like to thank the organisers of the World Economic Forum for putting this together, having a fantastic lineup here as well, and inviting you to come along this morning. And you will have noticed from the programme this year at the annual meeting that cybersecurity is a big deal. It's one of the foremost topics here now in the forum, and this is one of a series of initiatives that we'll be running throughout this week here in Davos. A quick plug to another very important initiative, which is tomorrow morning, and the launch of the new Global Cyber Centre that the World Economic Forum will be establishing and running. And that's a very exciting time for the forum, but also, I think, for many partners in industry and governments who will be coming together as part of that initiative. So why is it such a number one topic for the forum? I guess I don't need to explain. Of course, the threat is, as always, remains high, dynamic, flexible, changing all the time. And indeed, it seems to be affecting more and more of our citizens and businesses. We all remember some months ago, of course, the WannaCry attack, which affected thousands of companies and indeed people around the world in over 150 countries, I think. There are many other aspects as well. The level and impact of data breaches, again, seem to be incrementally growing. If you take into account the Yahoo data breach, for example, 3 billion users, personal data related to 3 billion people implicated in the attack. So the range, the scale, the impact of cybercrime seems to be increasing. Threat is up. Threat awareness, maybe half up. Certainly getting better, I think, in governments and across industries. But maybe not yet at the level which would correspond and give it the attention that it truly needs. WannaCry victims included some global multinationals who were caught out by a relatively cheap cybersecurity trick in the end, preying on those that had not patched certain operating systems. You probably know the story. So that's why we're here today, around trying to do something about this threat awareness. And we have some excellent speakers, as I said. We're going to begin shortly with our main speaker, Mark Hughes, from BT in the United Kingdom, and he will help to visualize on the screen the current picture that we're seeing in cybersecurity. Mark will be followed by Jayne Plunkett, who is the CEO of Reinsurance Asia, and Jayne's going to talk to us about this topic from a risk perspective. And then finally, Kieran Martin, the Chief Executive of the National Cyber Security Centre in the United Kingdom, bringing his particular expertise to bear and talk about especially public-private partnerships around this. So that's enough from me for the moment. We've got about an hour. After we've heard from our speakers, of course, I want to make this as engaging, I hope, from the floor as possible. So, Mark, please. Thank you.
Well, Rob, thank you very much indeed. Good morning, everyone. And as Rob says, I'm Mark Hughes, and I'm responsible for security at BT. We're a large global telecommunications carrier, many of you will know. Now, let me start by saying this is an interactive live demonstration, and of course they often demonstrations, and especially in an audience like this, have a habit of going wrong. That can either be down to the technology or down to the demonstrator. I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions about what that might be if it goes wrong, but so far nothing's happened. So I wanted to start by setting the frame a bit this morning. You've all seen the stats, but I wanted to draw out some paradoxes that exist within this. Half of us in this room think that we are prepared, but almost all of us are being attacked. Yet when we're attacked, only 22% of us say that we think that we've done enough. So I'm not quite sure sometimes what to make of some of the things that are going on around some of the stats. The other thing I would say is that at least half of us have made have transformed to taking our data into a cloud-based environment, and at least a big chunk of us, and about 20% of our research says that our organisations are on the road to doing that. So a number of things come out to me from that straight away. We therefore have networks and services where we increasingly see a direct B2C environment. Our consumers are therefore consuming our products and services in a way in which is incredibly dispersed through multiple touch points, which then consume those services that we provide for them in a way in which is completely proliferated. That proliferation means more network devices attached into the data that we want to serve them with. That poses more risk. So that's quite interesting, and how we deal with that with all this plethora of touch points is indeed quite challenging. In addition to that, all those devices that we're running and that our consumers are interacting with us with are churning out lots of data. Now, the data is often, in this form at least, the criminal's friend, because it helps them manipulate that data to then potentially use that and weaponize that against us. But as I'm going to show you in a minute or two, actually, almost using that very same data, so that paradoxically that data can be used in two ways. That can actually be used if we can use some of the stuff that we've been developing around AI and machine learning, that can assist us in combating the very thing that the criminals themselves are exploiting against us. So how to make sense of all of that is something that we have been thinking about for some time. Now, I wanted to take this now into a relatively straightforward view of the type of thing that's going on. Rob mentioned at the beginning that over the last year we've seen a lot of different types of attacks happening. And one characteristic of a lot of those is that they're relatively straightforward types of attacks. We seem to be tripped up again and again by similar types of things. So I'm going to use a scenario which for many of you in the room here will be reasonably familiar. Let's just take a scenario where we have a potential attacker, here shown in red, who's trying to gain a foothold onto a corporate network. This is pretty straightforward stuff. Conducting some reconnaissance, running some script, where they are then targeting the hosts or the IP addresses that we advertise in our networks to find something that might be vulnerable. So this is pretty standard stuff. Most attacks will often start in this way. And lo and behold, we can see on the chart here on the screen that this attacker has found something that's vulnerable. They're running a piece of malicious software against the organization, so they found something that's vulnerable. The next stage that they will do at this point is they'll then try and exploit that vulnerability by gaining access through some form of, for example, brute force attack, where they will use perhaps a known username, and they're looking for passwords, and they're running tools to brute force onto getting an actual foothold onto a corporate network. This is a very standard, often attack methodology that we see, which then subsequently leads to, obviously, the next part, which we hear a lot about in the headlines, which is then that attacker will exploit that foothold that they've got. They'll move laterally across the network, as exemplified here, and then they'll actually pick up data out of those data repositories, exfiltrate it, and the rest is on the front page of the newspaper or wherever it may turn up, as we know, with all the resultant regulation, fines, and everything else that, if not there yet, are coming to a lawyer near you in May this year with GDPR and others. So that's a pretty standard attack methodology that we see. And really what I want to now do is to get to a point where we can say, well, what do we do about this? We've got this massive amount of data that we're dealing with. These attack methodologies, while straightforward, you're looking for the proverbial I'll get there in the end, needle in the haystack to really work out what is going on. So if I switch over now to a tool that we've developed, and this is a visual analytics tool. And it's essentially using machine learning on vast data sets. So it's essentially an AI tool where we've developed this to help us make some sense of the vast quantities of data. Now, this screen that you see in front of you is a screen that one of our analysts working for one of us or one of our customers will see sort of day in, day out. And essentially it's taking data and unstructured data and using it and representing it in a way in which it allows them to start getting some clue to what is going on. And this is important. And why it's important is it's sitting on top of petabytes of information that we harvest from our networks every day. Literally massive data stores. And why this tool in itself is important is because the way our research teams have looked at this is, to coin it, is more Iron Man than Terminator. And what I mean by that is that the assisted learning that we've put into here and the machine learning is about having the analyst, the human at the middle of it, and then as opposed to the sort of Terminator type thing where it's completely automated. That's the route that we've taken and the route that we believe that we're going to need to have. More Iron Man, you know, the caricature being the guy in the suit but with all the bits to go around it. So this is the picture that an analyst would see coming in. And just a quick explanation. Here on the left, you see a representation of network traffic. This is quite straightforwardly, for those in the audience who are into this sort of stuff, a source and destination IP addresses. The source IP addresses are represented in red, destination in green. Here another representation where we see the data being displayed in a way in which is by department, so by name department. For example, in your companies it might be the finance department or the HR department. You can see the traffic going into each of those types of departments. That's often pretty useful because criminals will want to target particular parts of our organisation or indeed nation states. And on the right hand side here you can see the data represented geographically by locations in our business, so warehouses, factories or whatever. And down here a straightforward geographical source and destination map. And very importantly along the bottom, because we have these vast data stores which go back some time, we can very importantly rewind. And that is essential. That's something that we thought was absolutely essential. Why? Because the attack methodology that we see often starts with probing, with attempting to find vulnerabilities, and then looks to exploit those. So having the ability to rewind can give you the anatomy of an attack, which becomes very important. So if I look straight at this data chart here, I can see straight away from the representation of the data, all the same data represented in different ways, that there seems to be a spike of traffic here, which I'm particularly interested in. So I can drill into that traffic and I can immediately see there's some activity from this source IP address 8.90, which I'm particularly interested in. But I want to run that a bit over time to see what has actually been going on. And so I can actually get here, off the raw data, a view of what the attacker is actually doing, an over-the-shoulder view. So you can see over the time period, this source IP address that I'm particularly interested in is looking and probing against those those hosts in my organization. And as you can see, we've seen a fairly slow build-up and then suddenly what would be relatively indicative of a brute force type of attack. Now that's very valuable information. Immediately, in a matter of seconds, I've gone from something that could have taken us a long time, literally days, to get to something that is going to give me a lot more clues about what's going on. Now, that's not good enough because I need to know a little bit more before I really want to start taking perhaps very heavy lifting remedial action in our networks. And we often hear in the types of attacks that we hear, organizations shutting down networks, shutting down computers, turn everything off. Before you start doing that, when we're a business like ours, that is huge decision-making stuff. So I'm particularly interested in finding out a bit more about what is going on. So I delve back into my data, and my data now tells me that this particular attacker is jumping and using a port 22. And for those of you technically minded in the audience, that's a particular remote access protocol called SSH. That gives me a lot more intelligence, if you want, from the data that I can now use. And I can now overlay, and I can delve back into my data lake, pick up my SSH traffic, and have a look at what else is going on. And immediately I can see that they are targeting one particular host on our network, which is that represented by that IP address 74.125. That's extremely valuable. That means that the teams can now go into, they can firstly look at our firewalls, see what the traffic is doing, the port 22 on port 22. You can also get right down onto that host and isolate that particular device in our network straight away and potentially stop any further proliferation of the type of attack. So far so good. That gives me a lot to go on, and I'm pretty happy about what I've achieved so far. But as I said earlier, what's powerful about this tool is that I can look backwards as well. So now I want to do a bit more than that. I want to look at the data in a slightly different way. So I can bring up other types of gadgets, as I call them. So I'm going to bring up here a bubble chart, shift that across here, and I'm going to drill on those source IP addresses because I'm particularly interested in what they're up to in our network and what they might have been up to in the past as well. I'm going to remove some of these time filters and trends, and then I'm going to see what the data is telling me. So whilst now I can see that that suspicious source IP address range is of interest to me, I've now immediately, through visualizing the data in a different way, come up with the fact that I have something more interesting, which is that source IP range of suspicious IP addresses is also interested in another host at some point in the past on our network. Now that's extremely valuable, again, because I might now be focusing all my efforts on that previous situation. Now I can drill in a bit more into this and find out what's going on here. So I'm quite interested in that. So with that, I'm going to now have another look at what's happening. And what I'm now going to do is I'm going to dig into the data, but this time I'm going to have a look at it not just from a source point of view, but from a destination point of view as well. So I want to know what it's targeting and how. And if I do that, and again quickly manipulate the data in such a way to give me another view of it, I can quickly see that there is on the right-hand side of the screen there now a relationship, as I saw from that source and destination IP address, that other host in our organization, between those two hosts in my network. So now I'm going to reveal, by clicking on this simply, to give me a view of what's happening in the network. And now, very powerfully, what I can immediately see is that there is a causal link between that suspicious source IP address, that 8.90 as you can see in the middle, and those two hosts, and what all those other 8.90 IP addresses have been doing around it. Very powerful. In a matter of minutes, literally, we've got to the point where we have established what is actually happening, indeed what has happened in the past, and we absolutely know there is something quite suspicious going on about that source IP address. Now, what that allows me now to do is obviously to remediate in our network or in our business straight away against those vulnerable targets. It means that perhaps the attacker now won't have the opportunity to gain that foothold and start moving more laterally around our network. If they do, I'll be able to spot it. But let me bring this really to life. You've all heard about the, all the things that we hear, all these attacks have stupid names. There's something about this world that, not Petya, this, that, and all the rest of it. Well, you've heard about all the attacks, WannaCry, Drown, back in the day, Heartbleed. The type of time that it took us to deal with the type of vulnerability that we saw in Heartbleed was days, literally days of trawling through bits of data, spreadsheets, we've all been there to find out what's going on. The type of time that it's taken us to deal with things like WannaCry and to work out where we might have vulnerable hosts in our organization took a matter of minutes. That time was extremely valuable. And when we look at some of the high-profile attacks that we've seen over the last few months, minutes, in fact, even hours, would have allowed an organization to protect themselves in a way in which had not had catastrophic consequences. And I'm thinking about organizations like Maersk, who were impacted by not Petya, as many of you will probably know. So if I wrap all that together, there's something else that's very important that comes out from this. And that is that I now have intelligence about this particular attacker, about what they've been up to potentially in the past. I can delve into that data lake and perhaps enrich that data even more using the machine learning that I've got. And then, having got some handle of what's going on, I can then share that information. And that's very essential that we now use that to then share with other organizations. And Kieran Martin and Rob, who are both here, we do a lot of sharing between us. In the last months alone, we've shared over 200,000 malicious domains with the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK. But not just with that, but we're on with Europol and with Interpol as well. We do a lot of information sharing to ensure that we can really get everyone else taking advantage of the type of short time frame that we're now discovering what these attackers are actually up to in networks like ours. Because I can bet you, if they're doing it in our organization, they're probably going to be trying everywhere else as well. So with that, over to you, please, Rob. Thank you.
Super, Mark. Thanks very much. And a very very visual insight, first of all, which helps us all to understand better about the current dynamics and the speed, of course, of cyber attacks, but the value of machine learning, the value of leveraging technology, as Mark was saying, to work against the way in which technology is abused as well. So let's follow up now. Jayne, if I could ask you for your perspective, maybe from a risk point of view. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I always say within the insurance industry, our job is to put a price tag on risk. That's what we do. And after watching the presentation from Mark, you might wonder, how on earth can you put a price tag on that? It's nearly impossible when you look at it and you look at the speed at which everything is changing. And that's one of the issues we face, because it is up to the insurance industry and reinsurers being part of that to take on this risk and to help organizations, governments, and individuals manage this risk. But it is very complex. And if you think about it in the context of what we normally do in the course of our business, the first step in all risk taking is to understand what you're covering, what's your exposure. So in a normal kind of case of insuring a building, we can understand where is the building, what is it made up of, how does it react to certain threats. That's really easy to understand these days. The second step is to understand what are the risks that faces. So again, if I take the simple example of a building, we know all about weather. So we know hurricane force impacts certain buildings. We know what flooding impacts different structures. So this is very easy for us to understand these days. Not so specifically, but for us to understand on an aggregate basis. The third step is always modeling the risk. And when you have the first two pieces, you can model that risk so you can understand it. And then we move to the fourth piece, which is managing the risk. And a lot of what was shown here is about managing and mitigating the risk. Because the first step, whether it's you taking your individual risk or a company taking the risk, is to try to manage that risk yourself, to try to lower that risk. And in the case of property risks, that's things like different building codes, building seawalls, things that protect that risk. And then the last step is transferring the risk. And so in the discussion around cyber, it's relatively challenging, because oftentimes the first discussion is around transferring the risk. And I would say within the insurance industry, we have to first participate in the first steps so that we can eventually transfer the risk into the industry and into other financial mechanisms. So when we look at this case of cyber, the biggest important thing is to have the right kind of partnerships. So that's why when we talk about public-private partnerships, it's really critical that we can share this data that Mark was talking about, and that we can understand what are the threats. Because otherwise, it's very difficult to model the real risks that are out there, particularly when we talk about the high-end risk. The simpler risks of data protection have been covered by the industry for decades, but these more cyber attack risks are much harder to quantify and to manage.
Jayne, I noticed that cyber risk insurance is one of the growing areas of interest for business, and I've seen some very large numbers, you'll know better than me, attached to how big that industry is at the moment and how it's likely to grow over the next 5 years maybe. But as you say, at the heart of it is a real challenge for the industry around understanding and modeling a risk that is not well understood. It's us and Kieran and Mark who are in a position whose job it is to understand very well. Even we admit to having some significant gaps in our knowledge. And so you talked about the need to do that. I just wonder what sort of strategies you have in place to effectively deal with that. In the end, if you're selling an insurance product where on both sides maybe there is some element that is fuzzy at best. I just wonder how, from an insurance point of view, you can manage that, the risk to the risk offering that you're providing.
I think that's the challenge that we face today, is to really understand the risk well enough to, as an industry, take enough of it, because there's an extreme amount of uninsured risk in this area today. But we've managed that in other places. So if you think about things like nuclear risk, that's another risk that in the past was not necessarily well understood, or maybe too large to manage for one entity. And there we've moved to pooling mechanisms, which help to spread the risk across different entities. So I think that there are solutions out there, but it's still early days in terms of developing those solutions. And that's why these partnerships are so important in terms of developing the risk landscape for cyber.
It's an example of how cyber has indeed become sort of a major game changer and a player in so many different industries from so many different perspectives. Kieran, your perspective perhaps from a government point of view?
Well, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. I think it was President Reagan who described that as the most dangerous sentence in the English language. So from the UK government's point of view, I think after a decade or so of frustration, we're starting to feel quite optimistic about trends in cybersecurity. There are a number of reasons for that. One is some really good developments in the private sector, such as we've seen from Mark, and encouraged by the development of insurance. I'll come back to that. But also because we've stopped doing some really stupid things that haven't been working. So if you don't mind, Rob, if we can just do a bit of a show of hands, just to get a sense, how many people in the audience would describe themselves as technical in this space? Excellent. Right. So
I expected your hand to go up, Mark, but sure.
Okay. So how many people will have received the advice about not opening untrustworthy links? How many people feel confident they know what an untrustworthy link is going to look like? It's more than I thought. And how many people will have heard the advice about using long, complex passwords and change them often? Okay, those two bits of advice are more or less stupid in our view. I'll come back to that. Hold that thought. The second thing we've stopped doing is we've stopped overestimating and mischaracterizing the adversary. We've allowed this narrative to take hold that there are undefeatable beasts out there. They're a mixture of undefeatable nation states and teenagers in suburban bedrooms, and none of them, we can't do anything about any of them, rather than looking at very hard-headed things like insurance against business risk, looking about how we can be good enough to get threats down to acceptable levels, and particularly from the business point of view against cyber crime, as opposed to some of the more Hollywood end of the problem, just getting real about dealing with some of the problem, and we're getting a bit more serious about that. And the third thing is we're starting to base public policy on evidence. I've found over the last decade and a half quite extraordinary, given this is the revolution that has given birth to big data, and yet we were making public policy up based on anecdote and notions. We were saying private sector information sharing, I'll come back to really good information sharing like what we've heard, private sector information sharing between competing companies in the same sector is the answer. Well, it helps to a point in part. If anybody has a piece of serious evaluated research as to how effective it's been, please send it to me, because I can't find one anywhere in the world. But the US made this the fulcrum of their strategy under the first Bush cybersecurity strategy in 2004, and we're still doing it despite its obvious limitations. And instead, we're now moving on to some more evidence-based points. So we were doing things like we were just calling for partnerships without really knowing what it means. We were giving people terrible advice. We were giving users terrible advice, and we were over-glamorizing the threat. A lot of that's stopping. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to look at things, we're looking at technology, but we're also looking at economics, and we're looking at behavioral science, and we're trying to make incremental improvements to the problem. And we're doing that through innovation, and through transparency about the data. So I'll give you a few examples, but we're going to publish some of them this week. We've looked at fundamental market flaws. So we know that some of the most recent, most destructive attacks are on something called the Mirai botnet, which some of you will have heard of, are based on the concept of hijacking Internet of Things devices at scale and pointing them at something. So you used to be able to point only so much firepower at a target. Now with the Internet of Things, you can, because there's so many more devices, your firepower is greatly increased. Simple concept. The economic problem, and this has happened in several attacks, so there was a famous attack at the end of 2016 using a bunch of closed-circuit TV cameras to attack a company. The economic problem is the cameras worked entirely perfectly throughout the attack. So if you're in the economic chain of the manufacturer, operation, and a customer of the cameras, why would you pay to fix a structural problem in the way internet traffic flows? The solution is to get telcos together, rework protocols that date from 1972, so clearly didn't have large-scale Internet of Things DDoS attacks in mind, and implement them. We're doing that. Spoofing is a huge problem. Organizations get spoofed all the time, individuals get spoofed all the time, and that causes real harm to individuals, businesses, governments. it doesn't cause any harm at all to the organisation being spoofed most of the time. In the UK's experience, the most spoofed organisation is our tax authority. All the people who were going to pay their tax still did because it was the law, and nobody punished the authority for it being misrepresented. So we had a serious problem in the internet ecosystem with nobody with the incentive to fix it. There's actually a rather simple protocol that we've implemented across the UK government, not yet at the scale we want to, but that blocked 500 million attacks, 500 million attempts to spoof last year. And then similarly, we're doing something now for the public sector, where if you're on a public sector network and you try to connect to a site, we have a whole range of data, some of it provided by Mark's company, some of it provided by other companies, some of it derived from government data. And if we know a site to be bad, we can stop someone going there. It doesn't give you a warning, it just says, no, you're on a government network, you cannot go there. We're scanning around 1 billion attempts a week to connect, and we're blocking around 500,000 per week. That is 500,000 trips to infected sites that could otherwise have happened. So there are real things there that matter, that involve looking at the economics of the internet and trying to look at those interventions that are often cheap, often not terribly sophisticated, but give you real results. So we're trying to measure now, and we're publishing this week, we're looking at how many phishing attacks we can see across the world, what is the UK share of those. And since we started this program of what we call automated or active cyber defense, the UK share has gone down from 5.5% to just under 3%. So you can measure, you can get the metrics, you can look at what works and what doesn't. You then get onto the behavioral science. We need to think about, get away from this nonsense about humans being the weakest link, because it's all about users. The internet is for its users. It's about as sensible as complaining about players in sports teams. And what things like this program do is they take away the problem. If we stop 500 million emails from the British Tax Authority being sent, then that's 500 million fewer times where people have to work out whether or not they should open them or not. But we then do need to make it easier. That's why we don't recommend defenses based on not clicking links, because someone will. And it's what you can do. It's organizations need to understand what they can do to contain an intrusion once it actually happens. And the password stuff, we're just making it impossible. So we got a bit of behavioral science. We got University College London to work out in psychological terms, what did current password advice involve? And it involved the mathematical equivalent of remembering a new 600-digit number every month. Literally impossible to follow, so people are going to cut corners. So we have to make it easy for people. So instead, what are we doing? We're trying to treat people like grown-ups. We're trying to say that if heads of organizations can't operate their own security procedures, then they shouldn't expect any of their employees to do it. We're trying to give simple public pieces of advice, such as if you want to look at it, what are the real implications of the Spectre problem and so forth. So if you get that combination of economics, behavioral science, and you get that innovation and you be transparent about working, there's a huge amount of progress you can make. 2 concluding thoughts. One is, if you don't believe me about about why you shouldn't base an organization's defenses on not clicking links, I urge you to look at a blog by our technical director, Ian Levy, called The Serious Side of Pranking. And this guy is a world-renowned expert in cybersecurity, and he almost fell for a prank email which had hoaxed various high-profile figures. There was one very tiny mistake which, had he been a little bit more careless, he would have fallen for it. If he is going to be susceptible to hoaxes, what hope is there for any of the rest of us? So I would encourage you to look at that. The final point is, this session is entitled, I notice, The Geopolitics of Cybersecurity, and none of us have talked about any of that at all. I make no apologies for that, because one really key aspect to all of this is there is so much we can do to improve those basic defenses, to get the return on investment for the attacker down, because it's all about the return on investment, whether you're after espionage, information valuable for commercial or state espionage, whether you're after money, whether you're after personal data. It's simply about, we are making it too easy for attackers. If we make it that little bit harder, they will go somewhere else, or they'll stop, or they'll achieve less. And that's the sort of things that the 3 of us are talking about today.
That's great, Kieran. And so this emphasizing the point that is about resilience, about getting your head around the idea, of course, that you can't get the threat down to 0. You can't stop every member of staff from clicking on a link, of course. You've got to build into your defense a layered defense capability that caters for the fact when that happens, what are you going to do? And there's some quite innovative ideas, I think, coming out of what Kieran is saying there, and how they can maybe expose to the business sector is the really interesting development. Behavioral science, it's about the behaviors of your people. Also in my world, fighting criminals is about the behaviors of criminals. At the other end of the machine, for a cyber attack, well, actually, it's not a machine, it's a person. It's a criminal whose behaviors you can also influence and better understand. Very risk sensitive, most criminals are. And so if there's something you can do about it in terms of your cyber defense capability that just makes it that much harder, that can make a big difference on the mindset also of the criminal. Right, we've got 25 minutes to go. I'm going to open it up. There's some fantastic thoughts that you've heard. Let's see what we've got from the floor. If you could each time introduce yourself, please, and then ask the question. Yes, please, sir.
Hi, it's Richard Folsom. Richard Folsom from Hong Kong in private equity. But just a question, a lot of the focus was on protecting against and mitigating the risks and then offloading those risks, which I find very informative and helpful. At the same time, I don't seem to hear much generally about when cyber criminals do make attacks, and those can in many cases be financial theft or theft of data, work on apprehending the criminals, identifying, apprehending, and out of that perhaps creating precedent where it doesn't pay to be a criminal because criminals will actually be found out, apprehended, and prosecuted. Is there an aspect of that we see development on?
Kieran, maybe? Do you have a view on that?
Well, you're the head of Europol, so you may have more of a perspective than I will, so I'm happy to give you...
I'm also the chair of the session, so I can direct it to someone else.
There is, of course, an issue. Of course, I mean, my organisation isn't a law enforcement one, but where possible, we will. Our first priority will be to do exactly as you say, and there are some really interesting cases. A lot of the response to cyber attacks doesn't involve new concepts. But one of the things that is new is that it is perfectly possible to run large-scale hostile cyber operations, criminal or state, without ever setting foot in the country that you're attacking. So, for example, the United Kingdom and most of Western Europe are really rather stupid places to run large-scale cybercrime operations from because of the nature of law enforcement, the nature of detection, the nature of the judicial system. And so it is an issue for us where we can, we will struggle sometimes to extend the proper reach of law enforcement to some of the actors that we're most interested in. Having said all that, it's not a counsel of despair. This is a global age and people travel. And there have been a number of high-profile cases where someone may have, slipped into, the sphere of ourselves and our allies, which are quite extensive in law enforcement terms, in terms of the EU and North America and other parts of the world. And certainly, two final points. One is we always prioritize investigations to make sure that they are admissible. It's not just a question of finding that they're admissible in terms of evidence. And secondly, I think there have been some interesting developments, even towards some of the most supposedly untouchable groups, led by the US, to give the US government its due credit, where they have started a process of indicting people, even if the hope of seeing them in a court of law appears relatively forlorn. But that achieves a number of objectives. One is it shrinks the world of the attacker dramatically. In terms of these people are often relatively well off. This makes the West or the US's sphere of influence a no-go area for them. And secondly, it imposes some form of cost on the sponsoring government or the sheltering government, because it puts hard evidence out there that is open to public scrutiny, that then can be used against that country in international debate about norms, about acceptable behaviour. Whereas 10 years ago, when people were starting to accuse certain countries of misbehaviour in cyberspace, the response was always, show us the evidence. Of course, this innovation says, well, here is the evidence, and if you would like to contest it, then there's due process available. So there are things we can do in the law enforcement
I think we have to challenge this notion, I'll come back to you in a minute, sir. I'll challenge the notion of criminal impunity. Because we are fighting back. There are some good successes. But in the law enforcement world, we're obsessed about attribution, having enough information to even attribute the crime to somebody, and that's often very challenging. Even if we pass that test, also obsessed about jurisdictional access, of course, the point that Kieran made. But it is possible, and cyber criminal investigative techniques are certainly increasing, using some of the machine learning technology that Mark was highlighting earlier, and building networks. That's the really important thing. So not just relying on old-fashioned legal systems of cooperating, but in fact building networks of collaboration. And a very iconic, in fact, police success in the last 6 months or so was the takedown of the two largest dark marketplaces online, Alphabet and Hansa. Europol, Dutch police, FBI were involved. Really innovative work by some of the police authorities there in identifying who the administrators of those two forums were, and then some great coordinated work to take them down. So it is possible, but very challenging. Yes, to you, please.
It's Brett Solomon here from Access Now. Thanks very much for the discussion. I know that much of it is actually about cyber defence. I'm also interested in the cyber offensive capacity. As we know, around the world, many governments are passing cyber security bills and cyber security laws that have massive implications on citizens and also on geopolitical relations. Those laws have on citizens' rights also massive implications. We're talking about creation of surveillance regimes like we've never seen before, which infringe on right to privacy outside of jurisdiction, on rights to freedom of expression. So I'm just wondering if you could reflect upon the human rights implications of the cybersecurity infrastructure and frameworks that are currently being built.
Yeah, I think there are, if I don't mind starting on this at least, I think it's one of those challenging areas of how to get cybersecurity right, how to deal with the essential dichotomy of value that the internet presents, of course. We want to keep it as free and open and as private as possible. We want to prevent bad actors from exploiting that. And yet, so there's this sort of raging debate often about to what extent we should allow the police to police the internet. Of course, we managed to do that in other parts of our society over many years. We've constructed through a democratic process proportionate legislative regimes that allow law enforcement authorities to have controlled, narrowly defined, proportionate access to certain data in certain categories. I'm thinking of the telecoms industry especially, of course. That has not yet, a regime like that has not yet been applied to the world of the online world. And that's a challenge for all of us. We haven't got that right yet. I'm not sure what the solution is, but you're right in the sense that we've got to make sure that we don't overcook this and spoil the whole point of what the internet was about in the first place. A very fine line. I don't know if there's any others who wanted to pitch in there. If not, I'll move on because we're running out of time. Here, please, John.
John Shipman from the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. I actually want to ask an insurance question. My organisation has cyber insurance. We called on it, and so that's good. You've talked about the way in which to measure risk, but listening to the head of the National Security Cyber Centre saying that some of the typical advice given is maybe not so material to the mitigation of risk. When you are looking at an organisation, you might measure a bit what the threat against that organisation is, but then you might measure what are the protocols that they've instituted, what are the behaviors that they've encouraged that maybe ensures that they're mitigating that risk, and therefore you can fairly reduce the premium. But if you're listening to what Karen Martin might have said, some of the things that you were judging good behaviors or protocol yesterday are not necessarily relevant anymore. So what is your current list today of the 3 or 4 things that you look for an organization to doing in order to reduce their premium?
Yeah, so I think this topic of what are the 3 or 4 things, what are the protocols, it's not different, in my opinion, in this line of business than it is in other lines of business. If you think about health standards, so we've been insuring people for health insurance for many, many years, and the health standards change from time to time as well. One day you're meant to eat certain foods, and then a year later those foods are now no longer good enough. So I think that's one of the things we always deal with is the changing standards as we gain more information. And I don't think that's something that we have to be afraid of. I think that's a natural part of life. We see the same thing in property insurance, right? We get better and better at understanding what mitigates risk in terms of property. So, so I think you're right in terms of we learn more and more about what are the right protocols. But I think that that's the big part of cyber insurance that we probably haven't talked about yet, which is the risk management side. So transferring the risk, like I said, is sort of the last option. It's all the things you do before you transfer the risk that are the most important. And I think for each organization, it's a bit different depending on what industry they're in.
Mark, I wonder in your world, because you are so deeply involved in supporting so many businesses and in government, do you see yourself as also one of the shapers of protocols and standards?
I think less so necessarily protocols and standards. I'm going to mention a word now, and you're all going to sort of fall off your chairs and yawn. Governance. The more I see of organisations, and indeed our own organisation, is being able to govern this risk is something which I think most organisations are really challenged with. So firstly, just about how it works within the organisation, who has responsibility for what. Bear in mind that most large organisations today are tech companies with a bit of activity on the side. And how their tech is often managed, in fact maybe some of your tech is managed in a very big outsourced way, outsourced even to organisations like ours as well. So that understanding of whose risk is whose and how that dissipates through various complicated, convoluted supply chains is something that is very hard to get your arms around. And it's something which in this world, because cyber characteristically has two things that doesn't set it completely apart, but certainly are very characteristic. Generally, what's happening to you is being done to you. Now, you could say that storms and stuff like that happen to you, but generally it's happening to you. In other words, you don't do it to yourself. Because we're, for an organisation, pretty good at sometimes doing things to ourselves. I'm not going to talk for anyone else in the room. And secondly, the velocity of the risk. It's often very rapid. And as Kieran is saying, and as Jayne said, the types of things that happen change very rapidly. So what you have to have is an organisation that understands itself well, understands what it's got, and therefore can adapt very quickly. And that does come down to frameworks of governance, 3 lines of defence, all of those sorts of things. We really grapple with that, and we grapple hard with it to try and get it right, because we know I've just shown you, when something happens, you might have to be on that in minutes. And flexing the organisation that way is quite hard. And it hasn't got really anything to do with security. It's just got to do with how you can make your organisation happen and work in what the ever more complicated world that we live in. So I think, Rob, there's something around that. And then, of course, standards and protocols, I'll just mention very briefly, there's lots of them. But there's some excellent advice out there. We seem to reinvent them quite a lot, but there's the NIST framework, which is very useful, Cyber Essentials, other things that come out, certainly in the UK. We're deploying that right way through our 18,000 plus vendors that we use in our supply chain. That very powerful, straightforward information. When you actually get down to it, even the ISMS from 27001, the Information Security Standard, they're pretty straightforward. They all say similar things. And so there's good stuff out there. Use that as a framework. But ultimately, how quickly your organisation can adapt and flex is what I find the most important.
Yeah, and ransomware's helped to sort of put that in a very sharp perspective. It's become perhaps the number one malware threat affecting businesses. If you haven't got the governance right, if the board isn't already engaged in this, they're going to have 15 minutes notice to decide whether or not to pay that ransom, with all the implications that are hiding behind that. There's a question at the back, please, sir.
Thank you very much. Jan Skaklinch, I'm ambassador of Latvia to UN in Geneva, and with 15 years involved in international debate on internet governance. My question is to all panelists, actually. You were talking about partnerships and cooperation, and it was always kind of tailor-made for the sake of your organization. In UN, there is a lot of discussion whether there should be any kind of international cyber convention. And I would be very curious to hear your opinion whether that would be helpful, kind of international agreement on cyberspace, whether that would be helpful in addressing challenges that we're talking about in this session.
Yeah, I used to believe in Father Christmas as well, but what do you think, Kieran, about the road we have to take as a community of governments towards norming this?
It will evolve. There's the famous picture of cities 100 years ago with cars pointing in all directions because there were no rules of the road, and over time, organically, societies and governments reach some form of mechanisms for dealing with this new reality, and individual societies will get there, and over time the international community will get there. I suspect, and certainly this is the position of the government I represent, that whilst there is some very useful work going on and some parts of this that lend itself to greater formalised understanding, that an attempt to get a sort of global summit to thrash out a sort of global treaty is probably not going to result in much. And I'm not trying to change the subject. I just think that if there was one thing that would greatly enhance the standard of cybersecurity, including privacy for all citizens, regardless of where they are in the world, is a sustained effort across the backbone companies of the internet age, whether that's the actual tech giants, but also the managed service providers, the people who provide the services to companies, to fix with governments across the world systemic flaws that in just the everyday flow of internet traffic, that would get you so far, it would make those routine attacks so much harder that I would like to focus some of our efforts there. I do think this will have a role to play, but I think we're probably talking in decades, not small numbers of years. It's my personal view.
Espen might have a view on this as well, given his experience. Right at the front here, please.
Yeah, on that particular question, I think it's helpful intellectually and politically to distinguish between two sets of challenges. One is what you can broadly define as cybercrime and other types of disruption from non-state actors, where most governments, maybe not all, but most governments share a common purpose in reducing that. I think the opportunity for global standards will be relatively high, technically difficult, I'm sure, but in principle. But the geopolitical competition in cyberspace with espionage and capacity for cyber attacks will clearly not be mediated very easily through international norms because the same governments are at cross purposes. So I wonder if there's a way that we can sort of make sure there are two discussions about that in which governments may have a shared purpose, and that where we simply have to recognize that governments are across purposes. Would that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, and also the idea that there is that meanwhile in industry, in businesses, they just have to pick up the mantle themselves and do what they can and be quite proactive and show a lot of energy around this and not wait. I'm sure businesses have learned this lesson for a long time. Not wait for government to shape this, but instead do it themselves. So this is I think one of the most challenging areas, but we shouldn't wait for the sunshine to come into view. Right, who's next, please? Do we have any more questions?
I'll just perhaps, if I may, Rob,
Thank you, Mark.
questions, just pick up on the previous point. So I think, and both your point as well, there is absolutely a space here for, well, let me just start by saying one of the things that is often misunderstood about how we ship traffic around the world, internet traffic this is that there are a lot of the way it's built is that there are geographical boundaries which are quite easily enforceable. Internet exchange points, the way we advertise routes and things like that. So there's this notion that once you're on the internet, it sort of just happens and everything can go everywhere. We've seen through some perhaps quite some stuff recently where this notion of shutting off and cutting off countries, it can happen because the technology does work in a way in which there are absolutely geographical boundaries to it. But obviously most of the time we're operating in a world where that there is the common protocols allow us to move stuff around very straightforwardly. And of course the cyber criminals that we're talking about do take advantage of that. And I think you hit on an excellent point about the fact that most of what bothers most of the people probably in this room and people that is cybercrime. And I think there is a quite a useful remit here to try and put your arms around that which is cybercrime. We hear a lot about blurring. Kieran mentioned the Hollywood end of the sort of nation-state stuff. Look, that's been going on for years and in very other shapes and other types and forms. The difference now, I suppose, is that there's an element of the friction is easier. But let's just concentrating on the actual criminal side of this. There are things that we can do that Kieran's mentioned that we are doing. We believe that is the right thing to do on behalf of our customers, where we can do that where they're being targeted by things that they don't even know that they're receiving and they never asked for in the first place. And I think there is also a concept here. My wife's a doctor, and she often talks to me and says, looks at me in a withering way, going, yet another thing that you don't know, Mark. But one of the things she gave me a little lesson on epidemiology the other day. And she gave me the 101 from the medical view of what's called herd immunity. that you actually never set out to vaccinate the entire population. You only vaccinate enough of the population at a certain level to stop it from spreading. And I think with cyber criminality, with a concerted effort, both from governance and maybe at a certain level, but certainly between industry, we could do a lot for the types of things that we've already seen results of in the UK that could at least remove some of the noise and perhaps create some herd immunity from some of the big infestations that we see. That would be a huge step forward and not particularly expensive, dare I say it, and actually, with the right will, we could do that. And I think, as you rightly say, most governments, most people in the world do agree that cyber criminality is harmful, whichever place you come from, unless you're a criminal.
Jayne, how deep is the engagement between the risk industry and government in this sector?
So it's, it's a building engagement because if we look at the entire spectrum of risk that we can take within the industry, we've already talked about some of the simpler things that we can do. And when we think about data security, it's mostly about data protection, right? Most of what we're talking about is protecting people's data. And yes, cyber criminals are trying to attack and trying to take over the data, but we also have to protect data from just the simple human error. As you said, it's not always human error, but in a lot of breaches, it is a human error. And so I think as you said, there's a lot of work we can do just on the fundamentals of protecting data within corporations, and particularly within SMEs who don't always have the same infrastructure and funding to protect the data that large corporates do. But the discussion with governments is, it progresses in different regions, right? And I think that's one of you raised it already, that's one of the interesting points is within different regions or within different countries, there might be good discussions going on, but this is a cross-border discussion. So how do we really get the cross-border discussion? And as you say, I think companies cannot wait forever. So companies are in business to do business, have to move forward.
Very good. 3 minutes, 10 seconds. Time for one last question. If not, we'll be wrapping up. Okay, I'm going to ask each of you maybe for a minute of your time. Starting with you, Mark, your main message here today.
So it's likelihood is something that we struggle to work out because, as Jayne was saying, there isn't necessarily the data, but impact is something that we can work out. So my advice or my final thought is use what you've got in your organization, because there's stuff going on where you can translate to assess cyber risk in an organization based upon impact, because you will know more the impact into your organization, what's happening. So look for parallels in the organization to help assess the risk. And my real overriding point is get proactive. Get what we call red teaming. Get people out there ferreting around, looking inside your networks as to what's happening. Because I can tell you this, you'd rather hear it from people like me before you hear it from the front page of the newspaper.
Excellent. Kieran, please.
Or hear it from me.
True.
I would agree about being proactive. You only need to be good enough to beat away the adversary. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to compromise what you want to do with your business, with your organization for the pursuit of cybersecurity. Just understand what you care about. Look at those simple techniques. Look at sensible risk management, as we've heard about. And look at the evidence. We will publish more and more evidence, certainly in the UK government at the National Cybersecurity Centre, ncsc.gov.uk if you're interested. We'll be saying, this has worked for this people, for this group of people, this isn't working in this area. Just look around, make those judgments. I struggle sometimes to understand why organisations that deal with enormously complex matters, way beyond my understanding, will somehow struggle with this subject, which is essentially around risk management.
And on that point?
So I always think the interesting thing about risk is the difference between perceived and real risk, because sometimes real risk is high and perceived risk is low, and sometimes perceived risk is low and real risk is high. So I think within cyber, this is certainly a case where real risk is high. I think in the past, perceived risk was lower than it should have been, but as we said at the beginning, the awareness is up. So the perceived risk has been moving up in terms of cyber, and I think it should continue to move up because the real risk is high.
Yeah, and my point as I close is, yes, I think the real risk is higher, but at the same time, reflecting some of the comments we heard earlier, we've got to fight the perception that this is a lost cause. We have to fight the perception that this is an Armageddon waiting to happen. It's a risk, another risk, albeit a serious one, that has to be managed. And if you follow some of the practical advice that you've been hearing this morning, then it puts you in a much better shape, at least to deal with the worst excesses that are out there. Listen, I'd like to thank you all for coming this morning. Could you show your appreciation for our panel, please?